The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Harold Thompson's modest one-story house on Sadar Street. At 93 years old, Harold was one of the oldest residents in the small coastal town of Newport, but he never let his age define him. Every morning, without fail, he would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., a habit he had kept since his days in the Marine Corps during World War II. His movements were slow but purposeful as he made his bed with military precision. The corners were always tucked perfectly, and the surface was smooth enough to bounce a quarter off it. Another old habit he couldn't shake. His bedroom was simple but neat, with just a few pieces of furniture and several framed photographs on the walls. Most of them showed a younger Harold in his Marine uniform, standing proud with his fellow soldiers. After making his bed, Harold would carefully choose his clothes for the day. Even though he was just going to the local diner, he always dressed properly. He put on a clean, pressed light blue button-down shirt, khaki trousers, and his well-polished brown leather shoes. The final touch was always his veteran's cap, adorned with pins and medals that told stories of bravery and sacrifice from decades ago. Before leaving his house, Harold would stop at the mirror in his hallway. His reflection showed a tall man, slightly stooped with age but still standing straight enough to command respect. His face was lined with wrinkles that mapped out a lifetime of experiences, and his blue eyes, though faded with time, still held a sharp, alert look. His white hair was always neatly combed, and despite his age, he made sure to shave every morning. The walk to Joe's diner was exactly 8 blocks, and Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk, every house, and every tree along the way. He would leave his house at 7:15 a.m., walking slowly but steadily with a wooden cane that his son had carved for him years ago. The morning air was usually crisp, carrying the salty smell of the ocean that Harold had grown to love over the past 3 decades. Along his route, Harold would stop and chat with his neighbors. There was Mrs. Peterson, who always watered her roses at 7:20 a.m. He would tip his cap to her and compliment her flowers, making her smile every time. Then there was young Tommy, the paper boy, who would cycle past at 7:30 a.m. Harold never failed to give him a wave and sometimes shared stories about what the town was like when he was Tommy's age. Joe's Diner had been Harold's breakfast spot for the past 30 years. The bell above the door would chime at exactly 7:45 a.m. when he pushed it open, and Sally, the waitress who had worked there for 20 years, would already have his coffee ready. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she would say with genuine warmth in her voice. Harold was more than just a regular customer. He was part of the diner's family. His usual spot was the third booth from the door, where he could see both the entrance and the street outside. Another military habit, always being aware of his surroundings. The vinyl seats were worn smooth from years of use, and the table had slight scratches that Harold knew by heart. He would carefully place his napkin on his lap, straighten his silverware, and open the menu, even though he had memorized it years ago. The other regular customers at Joe's treated Harold with respect and admiration. Many would stop by his table to say good morning or ask about his health. Young parents would often bring their children to meet him, pointing to his veteran's cap and whispering about his service to the country. Harold would smile and sometimes share a simple story or two, carefully choosing ones that wouldn't frighten the little ones. Every morning, Harold would order the same breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, a side of crispy bacon, and endless cups of coffee. He would eat slowly, savoring each bite while reading the morning newspaper that Sally would bring to his table. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and exactly how Harold liked to start his day. Little did Harold know that this peaceful morning routine, which he had followed faithfully for so many years, was about to face an unexpected challenge. But for now, he sat in his booth, sipping his coffee, completely at peace with his quiet life in this small coastal town that he called home. The peaceful atmosphere of Newport changed on a warm Tuesday morning when the rumble of motorcycle engines shook the windows of Joe's Diner. The Dark Ravens Motorcycle Club, with their black leather jackets and loud bikes, had discovered the small coastal town. At first, it was just 3 or 4 bikes parked outside the diner, but within a week, that number grew to 15. Harold noticed the change immediately. As he walked his usual route to the diner that morning, the sound of revving engines replaced the quiet morning chirping of birds. The smell of motorcycle exhaust mixed with the salty ocean air he loved so much. He watched as several mothers quickly guided their children to the other side of the street when they saw the group of bikers. The Dark Ravens had taken over the parking lot of Joe's Diner. Their motorcycles, Big black machines with chrome parts that gleamed in the sunlight were lined up in a row. The bikers themselves were large men with thick beards, covered in tattoos, and wearing black leather vests with their club logo. A dark bird with red eyes spreading its wings against a full moon. When Harold pushed open the diner's door at his usual time of 7:45 a.m., the familiar bell chime was almost lost in the loud laughter and rough talk coming from a group of bikers who had pushed together 3 tables in the center of the diner. Sally, who usually greeted Harold with a warm smile, looked nervous as she hurried between tables, trying to keep up with the bikers' demands. Harold's regular booth, the third one from the door, was occupied by 2 bikers who were spreading maps across the table and arguing about routes. He stood there for a moment, leaning on his cane, before slowly making his way to an empty booth near the kitchen. It wasn't the same. He couldn't see the street from here, and the kitchen noise made it hard to hear anything else. The other regular customers seemed to have disappeared. Mr. Johnson, who always read his morning paper in the corner booth, was nowhere to be seen. The young mothers who usually brought their children for breakfast before school had stopped coming. Even Tommy, the paper boy, no longer came inside for his usual morning hot chocolate. Sally managed to bring Harold his coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she poured it. "I'm sorry about your regular booth, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. "Things are different now." Harold gave her a gentle smile and patted her hand, telling her not to worry. But inside, he felt a deep sadness watching his peaceful breakfast spot transform into something unrecognizable. The bikers seemed to get louder as the morning went on. They cursed freely, told rough jokes, and sometimes threw food at each other, leaving messes that Sally had to clean up. Joe, the diner's owner, stayed in the kitchen most of the time now. His face showed worry lines that hadn't been there before, especially when he looked at the empty tables where his regular customers used to sit. One of the younger bikers, a man with a snake tattoo on his neck, noticed Harold watching them. He nudged his friend and pointed at the old veteran, making some joke that Harold couldn't hear but could tell wasn't friendly. The other bikers laughed, their eyes now turning to study Harold with amusement. Harold kept his face calm and continued eating his breakfast, though it didn't taste the same as usual. He remembered times during the war when he had faced much worse than unfriendly looks, but this was different. This was his home, his safe place, and for the first time in many years, he felt like a stranger in his own town. As Harold finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he overheard one of the bikers saying they had found the perfect town to make their new base. Newport was quiet, had good roads for riding, and best of all, no other motorcycle clubs to cause trouble. Harold's heart sank as he realized this wasn't just a temporary change. The Dark Ravens were planning to stay. Walking home that morning, Harold could hear the motorcycles roaring through the streets of Newport. He watched as people hurried inside their shops and houses when they heard the engines coming. The peaceful coastal town he had called home for 30 years was changing, and not for the better. But even as he worried about these changes, Harold had no idea that his own quiet life was about to become the center of an unexpected conflict. Over the next 2 weeks, Harold faced increasing harassment from the Dark Ravens, but he refused to change his morning routine. Every day, he would walk into Joe's diner at exactly 7:45 a.m., even though he knew what was waiting for him inside. His military training had taught him that showing fear only encouraged bullies, and at 93 years old, he had seen too much in life to be easily intimidated. The first serious incident happened when Harold was reading his morning newspaper. One of the bikers, a tall man they called Spike, deliberately bumped Harold's table while walking past, spilling coffee onto the newspaper. Instead of apologizing, Spike grinned at his friends and said loudly, "Sorry, Gramps, guess your hands must be shaking from old age." The other bikers laughed, but Harold simply used his napkin to clean up the spill and continued reading. Sally tried to help when she could, but she was scared of the bikers. She would bring Harold fresh coffee and whisper apologies, her eyes filled with worry. Harold would just pat her hand and tell her, "I've survived worse than coffee spills, dear." His calm response seemed to frustrate the bikers even more, as they were clearly trying to get a reaction out of him. The next day, 2 bikers sat in the booth directly behind Harold. They spent their entire breakfast making loud jokes about World War II veterans, suggesting they were too old to remember which side they fought for. Harold could hear every word, but he kept his focus on his breakfast, cutting his eggs with the same precision he did every morning. His hands didn't shake, and his face remained peaceful, which seemed to annoy the bikers even more. As the days went by, the harassment got more creative. Sometimes they would play their radio extra loud when Harold was trying to read. Other times, they would mock his careful way of walking or make exaggerated movements copying his stiff joints. A few of the younger bikers would pretend to fall asleep in their food, making loud snoring noises whenever Harold passed their table. One morning, Spike tried a different approach. He pulled up a chair right at Harold's table and sat down uninvited. "Hey, old-timer," he said, his voice dripping with fake friendliness, "don't you think it's time you found a new breakfast spot? This place isn't really for people your age anymore." Harold looked directly into Spike's eyes and replied calmly, "Young man, I've been coming here since before you learned to ride a bicycle." This response made some of the other customers who were brave enough to still come to the diner hide their smiles behind their menus. The bikers also started parking their motorcycles right under the window where Harold usually sat, leaving their engines running for long periods. The noise and exhaust fumes would fill the diner, making it hard for anyone to enjoy their meal. Joe, the diner's owner, had asked them politely to stop, but they just laughed and revved their engines even louder. Harold noticed how the harassment was affecting others too. Tommy, the paperboy, would now quickly throw the newspaper through the diner's door and run away instead of coming inside. Mrs. Peterson, who used to enjoy her morning tea at the counter, stopped coming altogether. Even Mr. Johnson, a retired police officer, chose to get his coffee to go rather than stay and face the bikers' intimidation. Through it all, Harold maintained his dignity. He continued to dress neatly every morning, his shoes polished and his veteran's cap straight on his head. He would greet Sally with a smile, leave her the same generous tip, and thank Joe for the meal. The medals on his cap caught the morning sunlight, reminding everyone of the respect he had earned serving his country. But the Dark Ravens were getting bolder. They seemed to take Harold's calm demeanor as a challenge, and their tactics were becoming more aggressive. The morning when they surrounded his booth, locking him from leaving for 10 minutes, Harold saw something change in their eyes. They weren't just playing anymore, they were trying to break him. What the bikers didn't realize was that Harold had spent 3 years in the Pacific during World War II. He had faced enemy fire, lost close friends, and helped liberate islands from occupation. Their intimidation tactics might have worked on others, but Harold had learned long ago the difference between real threats and bullies. Still, as he walked home that morning, he knew things were building toward a confrontation that couldn't be avoided much longer. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke up at 6:30 a.m., made his bed with military precision, and put on his usual neat clothes. As he pinned his medals to his veteran's cap, he looked at them for a moment longer than usual, remembering the brave men he had served with who never made it home. The walk to Joe's diner felt different that morning. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and dark clouds hung low over Newport. When Harold arrived at 7:45 a.m., he found all 15 members of the Dark Ravens already inside, unusually early for them. They fell quiet as he entered, and Harold could feel their eyes following him as he made his way to the only empty booth. Sally brought his coffee with shaking hands. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "maybe you should get breakfast somewhere else today." Her eyes were red, and Harold noticed a fresh coffee stain on her uniform where someone had deliberately bumped her. He patted her hand and said quietly, "Don't worry about me, Sally. I'll be just fine." As Harold opened his newspaper, Spike and 3 other bikers approached his table. They surrounded him, their leather vests creaking as they leaned over his booth. The diner went completely silent. Even the sounds from the kitchen stopped as Joe and his cook watched through the service window. Well, if it isn't the old war hero," Spike said, his voice loud in the quiet diner. "You know, we've been patient with you, Gramps, but you just don't seem to get the message." He reached out and knocked Harold's coffee cup over, sending hot coffee streaming across the table and onto Harold's lap. Harold didn't move, even as the hot liquid soaked through his pants. He carefully folded his newspaper and placed it to the side, his movements deliberate and calm. The bikers watched, waiting for a reaction, but Harold's face remained peaceful. Frustrated by Harold's lack of response, Spike reached out and grabbed Harold's veteran's cap. "Let's see what's so special about these medals," he sneered, ripping the cap off Harold's head. The sound of tearing fabric filled the air as several medals were torn loose, falling to the floor with small metallic sounds that seemed to echo through the silent diner. For the first time since the bikers had arrived in Newport, something changed in Harold's expression. His faded blue eyes suddenly became sharp as steel, and his back straightened with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Slowly, deliberately, he placed both hands on the table and pushed himself to his feet. Standing at his full height, Harold was eye to eye with Spike. Despite his 93 years, there was something in his stance that made several of the bikers take a step back. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried clearly through the silent diner. "In my lifetime," Harold said, his words measured and calm, "I have been shot at by snipers, bombed by planes, and trapped behind enemy lines. I have carried wounded friends through jungles and seen things that would turn your hair white." He bent down, slowly picking up his fallen medals one by one. "Each of these medals tells a story of sacrifice, young man, not just mine, but of the brave men who never came home." The diner remained absolutely still as Harold stood back up, holding his damaged cap and loose medals. "I did not survive Iwo Jima to be bullied in my own hometown," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "I didn't watch my friends die for freedom so that people like you could use fear to take it away from others." Thunder rumbled outside as Harold took a step toward Spike, who unconsciously backed away. "You want to know what's special about these medals?" Harold asked, holding them up. "They remind me that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're afraid." The silence in the diner was absolute. Even the most hardened members of the Dark Ravens seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpected show of courage. Sally had tears in her eyes, and Joe stood in the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. But Harold wasn't finished. What he would say next would change not just his own situation, but the entire dynamic between the Dark Ravens and the town of Newport. The old veteran had reached his breaking point, and now he was about to make a stand that no one would forget. The tension in Joe's diner could have been cut with a knife as Harold stood facing Spike and the other members of the Dark Ravens. The rain had started falling outside, its gentle patter on the windows providing a stark contrast to the intense scene unfolding inside. Harold's damaged veteran's cap was still in his hands, but he no longer looked like a fragile 93-year-old man. There was steel in his spine and fire in his eyes. "You boys want to know who I really am?" Harold's voice carried across the diner with unexpected authority. "I wasn't just any Marine in World War II. I was a combat instructor at Camp Pendleton before being deployed to the Pacific." A few of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the significance of this revelation. Harold carefully placed his cap on the table and reached into his wallet, pulling out an old, weathered photograph. "This picture was taken in 1943, he said, holding it up for everyone to see. "I trained over 3,000 Marines, teaching them how to survive in combat. Some of them were younger than you boys, scared but brave, ready to fight for their country." The photograph showed a younger Harold, standing tall and muscular, surrounded by a group of Marines in training. Even the most hardened members of the Dark Ravens couldn't help but lean in to look at the image of the powerful man their elderly victim had once been. "During the Battle of Iwo Jima," Harold continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I led a platoon of 30 men. We were pinned down by enemy fire for 3 days on that volcanic beach. No food, little water, and death whistling past our ears with every breath." He paused, his eyes distant with memories. 23 of my men made it home because we worked together, protected each other, and never gave up." Sally had stopped cleaning tables, standing still with a cloth in her hand, tears rolling down her cheeks. Joe had come out from the kitchen and was standing behind his counter, nodding slowly as Harold spoke. Even Tommy, the paper boy, had crept back inside and was listening from near the door. "This medal here," Harold picked up one of the medals Spike had torn from his cap, "is the Silver Star. I'd earned it by carrying 2 wounded Marines to safety under heavy fire. The Japanese had us surrounded, but I couldn't leave those boys behind." He placed the medal carefully on the table. "And this one is the Bronze Star, awarded for leading a counterattack that saved an entire company of Marines." The Dark Raven's tough exterior was cracking. Some of them had family members who had served, and they understood the weight of the medals Harold was describing. Spike's face had lost its sneer, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "But you know what's funny?" Harold asked, looking each biker in the eye. "None of those medals mean as much to me as this one." He held up a small, simple medal that had also been torn from his cap. "This is the Marine Corps Combat Instructor Ribbon. It reminds me that my greatest achievement wasn't fighting battles, It was teaching young men how to survive them. Harold's voice softened slightly, but his words carried no less power. I spent years teaching Marines about honor, respect, and courage. Real courage isn't about making others fear you. It's about standing up for what's right, protecting those who need help, and being willing to face your own weaknesses. The rain outside had grown stronger, but inside the diner, no one moved. Harold's words hung in the air, heavy with truth and experience. Some of the younger bikers were looking at their boots, unable to meet the old veteran's gaze. Others were staring at Harold with newfound respect, seeing him for the first time as the warrior he truly was. So now you have a choice to make, Harold said, straightening his shoulders. You can continue down this path of intimidation and bullying, or you can learn what real strength looks like. He picked up his damaged cap and carefully began reattaching the medals. I may be 93 years old, but I still remember every lesson I taught those Marines, and I'm willing to teach them again if you're willing to learn. The offer hung in the air like a challenge, but also like an opportunity. The Dark Ravens faced a moment of decision that would define not just their relationship with Harold, but their place in the community of Newport. The next few moments would determine whether they would remain bullies or begin a journey toward becoming something more honorable. The rain continued to drum against the windows of Joe's diner as Harold's challenge hung in the air. The old veteran stood tall, his damaged cap now carefully held in his strong, weathered hands. The Dark Ravens members looked at each other uncertainly, their usual confidence shaken by Harold's powerful words and unexpected offer. Spike, who had been the leader in harassing Harold, was the first to break the tense silence. What exactly are you offering to teach us, old-timer? His voice had lost its mocking tone, replaced by something that sounded almost like curiosity. Harold smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something they didn't. Meet me at the Veterans Center tomorrow at 10 a.m., he said firmly. Bring any of your members who want to learn what real strength looks like. I'll be there, just like I was there every morning at Camp Pendleton, ready to train young men who thought they knew everything about toughness. One of the younger bikers, a man with a fresh-looking tattoo on his neck, stepped forward. Why should we listen to you? He asked, but his voice wavered slightly. What could you possibly teach us that we don't already know? Harold walked slowly to the young man, his movements deliberate and controlled. Son, you wear that leather vest like armor, but I can see the uncertainty in your eyes. The same look I saw in hundreds of young Marines before they learned what true confidence means. He placed a gentle hand on the biker's shoulder. Your strength comes from fear, making others afraid. I can teach you how to find strength in respect, honor, and brotherhood. The diner had become so quiet that everyone could hear the coffee percolating behind the counter. Joe had stopped pretending to clean glasses and was watching the scene unfold with intense interest. Sally stood nearby, her order pad clutched to her chest, hardly daring to breathe. Look at your club, Harold continued, gesturing to the Dark Ravens gathered around him. You call yourselves a brotherhood, but real brotherhood isn't about intimidating others. It's about lifting each other up, protecting the weak, and standing for something greater than yourselves. Another biker, older than the rest with gray streaks in his beard, spoke up. My grandfather was a Marine, he said quietly. Never talked much about it, but he had medals like yours. The man looked at Harold with a mix of shame and respect. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Harold nodded appreciatively. Bring your motorcycles to the Veterans Center tomorrow. There's plenty of parking space. He paused, looking at each biker in turn. And wear those vests proudly, not as a symbol of fear, but as a promise to become something better. Spike, who had been unusually quiet, finally stepped forward. He bent down and picked up one of Harold's medals that had fallen under the table. Carefully, almost reverently, he wiped it clean with his sleeve before holding it out to the old veteran. I'm sorry about your medals, sir, Spike said, his voice rough with emotion. My dad, he served in Vietnam. He'd be ashamed of how I've been acting. He looked around at his fellow bikers. I'll be there tomorrow. As club leader, I'm making it mandatory for all Dark Ravens members. A murmur of agreement spread through the group. Even the most resistant members seemed to recognize that something important was happening. The atmosphere in the diner had completely transformed from tense confrontation to cautious hope. Harold accepted the medal from Spike with a nod. Tomorrow then, he said firmly. But first, I believe Sally here deserves an apology from all of you, and Joe's coffee is too good to waste on spilling games." The bikers looked appropriately embarrassed. One by one, they approached Sally and Joe, offering sincere apologies for their behavior over the past weeks. Some even pulled out extra cash, insisting on paying for any trouble they caused. As the scene unfolded, Tommy, the paperboy, slipped back into the diner. He walked straight to Harold's table and placed a fresh newspaper there, carefully folded. "Your paper, Mr. Thompson," he said proudly, no longer afraid. Harold sat back down in his booth, straightening his silverware with military precision. The dark ravens began to disperse, talking quietly among themselves about tomorrow's meeting. The rain outside had softened to a gentle drizzle, as if nature itself was acknowledging the change that had taken place in Joe's diner that morning. The stand Harold had taken wasn't just about confronting bullies. It was about offering a chance for transformation. Tomorrow would show whether the Dark Ravens were ready to learn what real strength meant from a 93-year-old veteran who had never forgotten the true meaning of courage. The Newport Veterans Center came alive at exactly 9:45 a.m. the next morning when the rumble of motorcycle engines filled the parking lot. Harold stood at the entrance, straight and tall in his freshly pressed khakis and military instructor's cap, watching as all 15 members of the Dark Ravens arrived on their bikes. The morning sun glinted off the chrome of their motorcycles as the bikers parked in neat rows, something they'd never done before. Spike led his men toward Harold, and for the first time, there was no swagger in their walk. Instead, there was a hint of nervousness, like young recruits reporting for their first day of training. "Good morning, gentlemen," Harold said, his voice carrying the same authority it had held decades ago at Camp Pendleton. "Follow me." He led them into the center's main hall, where old photographs lined the walls, images of brave men and women who had served their country through various wars. The bikers fell silent as they walked past the photos. Harold stopped at each one, sharing stories about the people in them. "This man," he said, pointing to a faded photograph, saved his entire platoon by running through enemy fire to call in air support. And this woman? She was a nurse who treated wounded soldiers under constant bombardment. In the corner of the hall, Harold had set up chairs in a circle. "Sit down," he commanded, and the bikers obeyed without hesitation. The change in their behavior was already noticeable. Their usual loud voices and rough language were replaced by respectful silence. Harold began by sharing more detailed stories from his time in the Pacific. He didn't focus on the glory of battle, but on the brotherhood, sacrifice, and courage he had witnessed. He told them about young Marines who faced their fears, about men who gave their lives to save others, and about the true meaning of strength. The younger biker with the neck tattoo, whose name was Jake, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir," he said, "how did you deal with fear? When you were in battle?" His question was genuine, vulnerable, showing the first cracks in the tough exterior the bikers had maintained for so long. Harold's answer surprised them all. "We were all scared," he said simply. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite your fear." He looked around the circle. "Just like it takes courage to admit when you've been wrong and to change your ways." Throughout the morning, more veterans from the community began dropping by. They shared their own stories, and the bikers listened with growing respect. An elderly Vietnam veteran named Frank brought his photo album, showing pictures of his motorcycle club from the 1970s, a group that helped other veterans adjust to civilian life. By lunchtime, something remarkable had happened. The Dark Ravens were asking questions about how they could help the Veterans Center. Spike suggested organizing a motorcycle escort for the upcoming Memorial Day parade. Others offered to help maintain the center's grounds and assist elderly veterans with home repairs. Sally from the diner arrived with coffee and sandwiches, no longer afraid of the bikers. She watched in amazement as these same men who had terrorized her restaurant now held doors open for her and said please and thank you. The transformation continued throughout the afternoon. Harold taught them about the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, about using their strength to build up the community rather than tear it down. The bikers began sharing their own stories, about troubled backgrounds, about searching for belonging, about wanting to be part of something meaningful. Near the end of the day, Spike stood up and addressed his club. "Starting today," he announced, "the Dark Ravens are going to be different. We're going to earn respect the right way." He turned to Harold. "Sir, would you consider being our club's advisor? We have a lot to learn from you." Harold looked at the group of bikers, seeing not the troublemakers who had entered his diner weeks ago, but a group of men ready to change. "On one condition," he said with a slight smile. "You all join me for breakfast at Joe's every Thursday morning. We'll call it the Veterans Breakfast Club." The men laughed and agreed enthusiastically. As they prepared to leave, each one shook Harold's hand firmly. The respect in their eyes was genuine now, not forced by fear or intimidation. They walked out of the Veterans Center changed men, their leather vests still proudly worn but now representing something very different. The roar of motorcycles filled the air again as they left, but this time the sound didn't make people run and hide. Instead, the town of Newport was witnessing the beginning of an extraordinary transformation, one that would impact their community in ways no one could have predicted. 1 year had passed since the day Harold Thompson had taken his stand at Joe's Diner. Newport had changed in ways that no one could have imagined. The Dark Ravens Motorcycle Club, once feared throughout the town, had transformed into one of the community's most respected organizations. Every Thursday morning, like clockwork, the rumble of motorcycles would announce the arrival of the Veterans Breakfast Club at Joe's Diner. Harold would sit at his usual booth, now surrounded by leather-clad bikers who hung on his every word as he shared stories and wisdom from his military days. Sally served coffee with a bright smile, no longer dropping cups from shaking hands. The biggest change came during the town's annual Memorial Day parade. Instead of hiding indoors as motorcycle engines approached, people now lined the streets to watch. The Dark Ravens, their bikes polished to mirror shine, led a procession of veterans through town. Harold rode in a restored military jeep at the front, his medals gleaming in the spring sunshine. Spike, who had once torn those same medals from Harold's cap, now served as the club's community outreach coordinator. He organized weekly visits to the Veterans Center, where club members helped maintain the building, assisted with paperwork, and most importantly, listened to the stories of aging veterans who had so much wisdom to share. The younger members of the Dark Ravens started a mentoring program for troubled teens in Newport. Jake, the biker with the neck tattoo, discovered he had a talent for connecting with young people who felt lost and angry, just as he once had been. Mr. Thompson taught us that true strength is about lifting others up. He would tell them, not pushing them down. Joe's Diner became more popular than ever. The Thursday morning Veterans Breakfast Club attracted people from neighboring towns who came to witness the unusual sight of elderly veterans and bikers sharing meals and stories. The walls of the diner now displayed photographs of the Dark Ravens helping at community events, alongside pictures of Harold from his Marine Corps days. Tommy, the paper boy, no longer had to throw the newspaper through the door and run. Instead, he became a regular at the Thursday breakfasts, sitting with the bikers and veterans, learning about history from those who had lived it. His school essays about local heroes always featured Harold and the transformation he had inspired. The Dark Ravens' leather vests underwent a meaningful change too. Below their original logo of the dark bird with red eyes, they added a new patch, a Marine Corps emblem with the words, "Strength through honor," beneath it. Harold had helped design it himself, and each member had to earn the right to wear it by completing community service hours and attending veterans programs. On Harold's 94th birthday, the club surprised him with a special gift. They had tracked down some of the Marines he had trained at Camp Pendleton, now elderly men themselves, and brought them to Newport for a reunion. The sight of these old warriors embracing, sharing memories, and meeting the transformed bikers brought tears to many eyes in town. Mrs. Peterson, who had once been too frightened to visit Joe's Diner, now organized a monthly bake sale with other local women to raise funds for veteran causes. The Dark Ravens would escort the ladies to these events, carrying boxes of cookies and helping set up tables with the same care they showed their motorcycles. The town council, which had once considered passing laws to keep motorcycle clubs out of Newport, now presented the Dark Ravens with a Community Service Award. The ceremony was held in front of Joe's Diner, with Harold giving the keynote speech about the power of second chances and the true meaning of respect. As Harold watched all these changes unfold, he felt a deep satisfaction. At 94, he had done more than just stand up to bullies. He had helped transform them into protectors. The medals on his cap, once torn off in disrespect, now shone brighter than ever, their meaning understood and honored by a new generation. The story of the 93-year-old veteran who changed a motorcycle club became legend in Newport, passed down to children and newcomers alike. But for Harold, Sitting in his usual booth at Joe's Diner, surrounded by friends both old and new, the real victory wasn't in the legend. It was in the simple sight of former troublemakers finding purpose, veterans finding respect, and a community finding its heart again. The legacy Harold created wasn't just about one old Marine standing up to bullies. It was about the ripple effect of courage, wisdom, and forgiveness, proving that it's never too late to make a difference, and that even the hardest hearts can change when shown the true meaning of strength and honor.